What you're about to hear will make your blood boil. In less than 24 hours on January 30th, 2026, silver experienced the most catastrophic crash in modern market history, a 26% plunge, the worst single-day drop on record, worse than the Hunt brothers collapse of 1980. And here's the terrifying part. Chinese speculators orchestrated the entire pump, dumped at the peak, and left everyday investors holding worthless paper contracts while they walked away with physical metal worth triple what exchanges now show. This isn't a market correction. This is the greatest betrayal in precious metals history, and I have the receipts. Let me paint you a picture of what just happened. Silver went from $122 per ounce on January 29th to $75 in less than 20 hours. That's a $47 collapse. For context, silver spent decades struggling to break above $40. It had only traded above that level during brief periods in its entire history. On Friday, January 30th, it dropped by more than $40 in a single session. Bloomberg called it parabolic, frenzied, and untradeable. Nikki Shields, head of metal strategy at MKS PAMP, said January 2026 would go down as the most volatile month in precious metals history. Dominic Sperzel from Heraeus Precious Metals, who's been trading for decades, admitted, "In my career, it's definitely the wildest that I have seen." But here's what they're not telling you on CNBC. While Western retail investors were liquidated and destroyed, physical silver in Shanghai is still trading at 80 plus per ounce. The paper price crashed to $75. The physical price in Asia? Still near record highs. That's not a market. That's a crime scene. To understand how China pulled off the greatest silver heist of the century, we need to go back 6 weeks. In mid-December 2025, something extraordinary started happening in Chinese commodity markets. Individual investors, retail speculators, and even large equity funds that normally trade stocks suddenly started pouring billions into silver futures. This wasn't organic demand. This was coordinated. China controls 60–70% of the world's refined silver supply. They implemented export restrictions on January 1st, 2026, requiring special government licenses to ship silver overseas. Only large, state-approved companies with minimum 80-ton annual production capacity could qualify. This immediately locked hundreds of smaller exporters out of global markets. Think about the timing. Export restrictions announced. Chinese speculators flood into silver. Prices explode from $30 to $122 in 6 weeks. And then, the moment retail investors in America and Europe are fully positioned, believing the silver squeeze narrative, convinced that $200 silver is inevitable. Boom. China dumps everything. China. On January 30th, the selling was so violent, so coordinated, so overwhelming, that silver plunged $40 in less than 20 hours. This wasn't panic. This was execution. Chinese speculators had been accumulating physical silver while buying paper futures to drive the price parabolic. Once Western retail investors were fully committed, they simultaneously dumped paper contracts while keeping their physical holdings. The result? Paper silver crashed 26%. Physical silver in China? Still trading at massive premiums. Shanghai silver prices are still above $80, while COMEX futures collapsed to the 70s. That's the great divorce. That's the betrayal. Here's how they did it, and why retail investors never stood a chance. Chinese speculators understood something that Western investors didn't. The paper silver market is a complete fraud. The ratio of paper silver contracts to actual physical silver is 356 to 1. That means for every real ounce of silver backing these contracts, there are 356 paper promises. This system works fine when everyone plays along and settles in cash. But China didn't play along. They systematically bought physical silver while simultaneously pumping paper futures. As prices rose, trend-following algorithms and commodity trading advisors jumped in, adding fuel to the rally. Retail investors, who had been waiting years for silver to finally break out, piled in with their savings, their 401ks, their dreams of generational wealth. Chinese banks even promoted silver accumulation products to retail investors in late 2025. Everyone was told this was the big one. The supply deficit was real. Industrial demand was exploding. Solar panel production needs silver. Electric vehicles need silver. The fundamentals were undeniable. And then, on January 30th, everything changed. The CME Group implemented percentage-based margin requirements in January 2026, hiking maintenance margins to 15% for standard positions. This was supposedly to prevent a clearinghouse collapse as prices surged toward $120. But the timing was surgical. Chinese speculators had already secured their physical silver. They didn't need leverage anymore. But Western retail investors? They were leveraged to the hilt, holding paper contracts, dreaming of $200 silver. When margin requirements spiked, forced liquidations cascaded through the market. Stop losses were triggered, leveraged positions were closed, and within hours, $100 billion in paper wealth evaporated. Meanwhile, in Shanghai, physical silver continued trading at massive premiums. Chinese speculators didn't lose a dime on their physical holdings. They dumped worthless paper contracts on Western investors and kept the real metal. Now let's talk about the export controls, because this is where the betrayal becomes crystal clear. China announced silver export restrictions starting January 1st, 2026. The official narrative was about securing domestic supply and supporting industrial demand. But here's what actually happened. By restricting exports, China created artificial scarcity in Western markets. Physical premiums exploded. Everyone believed silver was going to $200, $300, maybe even $500 because China locked up the supply. Chinese speculators knew the truth. The export restrictions weren't permanent. They were a pressure valve. Beijing could open them again anytime they wanted. But Western retail investors didn't know that. They believed the narrative. They bought the peak. And here's the most infuriating part. While China was supposedly locking down supply, Chinese speculators were actively accumulating physical silver, driving prices higher, and then dumping paper contracts on Western exchanges right before the export restrictions could be eased or exemptions granted. Data from Shanghai shows warehouse stocks fell to decade lows in late January, but that wasn't because of industrial demand. That was speculative accumulation. Chinese investors were taking physical delivery while selling futures. They understood the system, they gamed it, and retail investors paid the price. By late January 30th, after the crash, Chinese banks suddenly announced fresh measures to curb risks tied to retail gold accumulation products. Isn't that convenient? After the dump, after retail investors were liquidated, after the damage was done, then they implement controls. This wasn't regulation, this was coordination. The Chinese financial system pumped silver to 122s, dumped it at the peak, and then implemented safety measures after retail investors were destroyed. Let's talk about what's happening right now, because this proves everything. As of this morning, February 2nd, 2026, physical silver in Shanghai is trading above 78 yuan, $80 per ounce. COMEX silver futures, $75 and falling. That's a $5 premium for physical silver in Asia. But it gets worse. In Dubai, a 1-ounce silver coin is selling for $99.93. Let me repeat that. In the physical market in the Middle East, you cannot buy an ounce of silver for less than $100. But on the COMEX exchange, silver is trading at $75. This is the great divorce between paper and physical silver. And it exposes the entire fraud. The paper market crashed because leveraged speculators were liquidated. The physical market remains elevated because there is actual scarcity. Chinese speculators understood this. They accumulated physical silver throughout December and January, while simultaneously pumping paper futures. When margin requirements increased and the paper dump began, they kept their physical holdings. Western retail investors, they held paper. Worthless paper that crashed 26% in one day. And here's the kicker. COMEX registered inventories are down 70% since 2020. London vaults have lost 40% of their silver. Shanghai inventories are at decade lows. At current consumption rates, some regions have only 30-45 days of accessible silver reserves. So where's the silver? In the hands of Chinese speculators who bought physical while pumping paper. That's where. Let me tell you some horror stories from retail investors who got obliterated. On Reddit, Twitter, and investing forums, stories are pouring in from people who lost everything. These aren't just numbers on a screen. These are real people whose lives have been destroyed. One investor put $50,000 into silver call options when silver was at $100, believing it would hit $150 by February. Those options expired worthless on January 30th. Total loss, $50,000. That was his retirement savings. Gone in 24 hours. Another investor sold his house, convinced silver was going to $200 based on all the supply deficit data and export restriction news. He put $200,000 into leveraged silver ETFs at $115 per ounce. After the crash, his position was liquidated at $78. He lost over $60,000 in margin calls and is now living with relatives, trying to explain to his family how their home equity evaporated chasing a sure thing. A third investor, a teacher in her 50s, put her entire pension rollover, $180,000, into physical silver ETFs at $110, believing the experts who said physical silver was the safest play. Her ETF dropped 20% in one day. She's now working 2 jobs trying to make up the losses before retirement. Silver mining stocks? Absolute carnage. Silver miners dropped 19% on January 30th alone. Some junior miners are down 40-50% from their January highs. Companies that were trading at $5 per share in mid-January are now at $2. Retail investors who bought miners at the peak, believing they'd multiply their money as silver soared, are now buried under catastrophic losses. And the worst part? Many of these investors were following popular silver influencers and YouTube personalities who were screaming silver to 500, and this is the big one, right up until the crash. These influencers had charts, technical analysis, fundamentals. They made it sound scientific, inevitable, unstoppable. Some of these influencers are now deleting their old videos. Others are claiming they warned about volatility in the fine print. But their followers are broke, their sponsors are silent, and the damage is done. Meanwhile, Chinese speculators who accumulated physical silver in December and early January are sitting on massive gains. Physical silver in Asia is still near all-time highs. The speculators who drove prices to $122 aren't hurting. They have physical metal trading at 80 plus in Shanghai, while Westerners watch their paper positions bleed. They won. Retail lost. That's the reality. That's the betrayal. This crash has eerie parallels to the Hunt brothers' silver manipulation of 1980. Back then, Nelson Bunker Hunt and William Herbert Hunt tried to corner the silver market. They accumulated massive physical positions and drove prices from $6 to $50 per ounce. Then, on March 27, 1980, Silver Thursday, regulators changed margin requirements, and the Hunts were forced to liquidate. Silver crashed from $50 to $10 in weeks. The Hunt brothers lost billions. The 2026 crash is the same playbook. Chinese speculators accumulated physical silver and pumped prices. When prices hit $122, margin requirements increased. Forced liquidations cascaded. Silver crashed 30% plus in one day. But here's the difference. The Hunt brothers went bankrupt. Chinese speculators? They're fine. They kept their physical silver. They dumped paper contracts on Western retail. They won. And just like 1980, retail investors who believed the hype got destroyed. The system protects institutions and sovereign players. Retail investors are exit liquidity. Always have been, always will be. So what happens now? Here's my prediction. And pay close attention because this is critical. Short term, we'll likely see a bounce. Peter Brandt and Marko Kolanovic, two legendary traders who predicted the crash, have now flipped bullish for a snapback rally. Why? Because massive short positions need covering, and physical tightness in Asia could force a squeeze. But don't be fooled. This bounce is a trap. The real damage is done. Trust has been broken. Retail investors who survived will sell into any rally. Chinese speculators can dump again anytime. The paper market is discredited. Medium term, silver will likely settle in the $60–$80 range as the physical paper disconnect persists. Physical silver will trade at premiums in Asia while paper markets remain depressed. Long term, silver will recover, but it could take years. The fundamentals haven't changed. Industrial demand is real, supply deficits are real, but retail investors have been burned. The silver squeeze narrative is dead. China's sitting on massive physical stockpiles accumulated at lower prices. They control the supply. They control the narrative. They won. This was the great silver betrayal of 2026. China dumped silver and left retail holding the bag. And if you're still holding paper silver contracts praying for a recovery, you need to understand something. You're not an investor. You're exit liquidity. The silver market just taught us an expensive lesson. When sovereign players decide to dump, retail investors lose. Every single time. The paper market is a rigged game. The physical market is where real value lives. And China just proved they understand this better than anyone else in the world. If you survived this crash, consider yourself lucky. If you didn't, I'm deeply sorry. But learn from this painful experience. The next time a parabolic rally is driven by foreign speculators, remember January 2026. Remember the great betrayal, and protect yourself accordingly. Thanks for watching. Hit that like button if this video opened your eyes. Subscribe for more market truth, and drop a comment below telling me your silver crash story. I want to hear from why.